What made you turn to this topic?
I began to take an interest in whether or not there was such a thing as house churches when I was writing a book on bread. And a necessary part of a visceral history of bread was understanding the astonishing emblematic promotion of bread that occurred in the early Christian epoch, where bread was not only recognised as life-sustaining, but directly became a symbol of divinity. Bread became God, in effect, through the sacrament. That motif made me wonder, what was the sacrament like in pre-liturgical times? How was it performed among the first Christians who talked charismatically about breaking bread from house to house in the New Testament? You'd have to imagine an informal ritual among Jews in the first instance, who did it in houses, or so you'd imagine, and definitely not officially in the temple. You can't contemplate sharing in the synagogue a piece of symbolic flesh belonging to the renegade preacher Jesus. That would have been a scandal. So I started to look at a question that I realised couldn't possibly be handled in a book on bread. Were the very first churches actually private houses and apartments? And predictably, people had already published some remarkable findings on the topic. One of those texts strenuously denied the existence of house churches. It was a radical article by the theological historian Stefan Heid. Gab es Hauskirchen? Were there house churches? And he calls it a Phantom, a phantom. And he's since written a whole book, Altar und Kirche, adding remarkable material about the altar itself and what was novel about it, not just as a symbol that held only bread and wine, but as a physical object in architectural space. For Heid, there's no such thing as a house church. There was only ever one Eucharist conducted under the oversight of one bishop, one in every centre where there were Christian gatherings in the Mediterranean. And there was only ever one altar and one bishop per community. Heid doesn't deny that holy things happened in houses. Of course, selbstverständlich. There were sacred moments, but they don't equate to anything like the Eucharist that happens in a church. Heid dismisses the idea that there were multiple tables anywhere within domestic space that functioned as altars, but then reverted to profane daily use. He thinks that a proliferation of thousands of cells would have spread rampant heterodoxies, contrary to the relative unity of the religion from early times. So I had to decide, is Heid right or is he wrong? Were there house churches or weren't there? What does the sum of archaeological and textual evidence best support?
What are the broader implications of your research?
I think that research questions take on a special lustre when the doubt about which interpretation is correct seems in some way paradigmatic. One of the allegations that Heid made really struck me. Scholars in the past have wanted to see the existence of house churches because it accords with their reformed mindset. In particular, their wish to offset the institutionality of the official church. They like the theory of house churches, even though it's a phantom, because it flatters some homespun evangelical enthusiasm for immediate revelation among individuals. Heid thinks that it's a liberal Protestant kind of slant against the establishment, where holiness is in your soul and not in building stock, arbitrary canons, hierarchies, or real estate. So let's all go and see history supporting the autonomy of the individual instead of entrenched cartels of power and control. I totally see his point. I mean, I too have to confess that it suits me to believe that there were house churches. I've literally written a book on the history of bread where I'm observing how people, lay people, bake their own sourdough to bring to church. In Orthodox tradition, it's called prosphoro. So you yourself, if you feel sufficiently pious, can bake the oblation destined for the altar. You seal the sourdough before baking it with the stamp sfragida. and bring it to church where it's consecrated as the host. But you just baked it in your little electric oven, just as folk baked theirs for centuries in the communal courtyard oven in your domestic block. That tradition made me want to see continuity, as if bread baking and making sacred were both in the hands of laity, even if the bread is transubstantiated in the last minute under the agency of the Holy Spirit, with or without trained clergy. My motive here wasn't religious, but just your typical bourgeois progressive historical optimist. We like to celebrate the autonomy of the individual as opposed to directed conformity with a universal template. A story about the agency of independent people in private creative circumstances is empowering, and it's one that we undoubtedly want to hear. I ended up disagreeing with Hyde, but I had to give him ground. He helped me see that I too have an incentive to construct a history in a way that suits. I want my story to support the motif of active personal engagement with spiritual tradition rather than passive reception of dogma. As a scholar, your motive is often your worst enemy because it insinuates bias into your method. It makes you want to say something that the facts don't necessarily support. And typically, you only go looking for evidence that already supports what you choose to believe. I find this repeatedly among scholars, and they're never military historians, by the way, who will opine this or that about Israel and Palestine, carefully looking only at the evidence that confirms their prejudice, and ignoring anything to the contrary, or repudiating the case without having read what defends it. And I've always felt that your motive as a scholar is both your friend and your foible. It gives you the zeal to write and to make a case, but the polemical impulse also leads you to partiality. In my article in Colloquium, I was determined to let none of my predispositions show or influence the case. And to this end, I had the most scrupulous editor, Dr. Anna Neuenberger, and the outstanding readers that she appointed as peer reviewers to keep me accountable. I didn't have a religious basis for citing one way or the other, but only a sentimental fondness for the motif of people baking holy bread. But whatever I came to the question with, I diligently suppressed it to examine the facts in their innocence.
What was the best part about writing the article?
The personal pleasure in writing this article was that the topic allowed me to marry two kinds of scholarship that I particularly love. One is philology, where you look at instances of language and observe how meanings change or develop or didn't exist at a certain date. The other is archaeology, where you figure out what kinds of configurations were possible or economically likely in architectural spaces, cities, communal dwellings, streets, courtyards, and so on. And they naturally overlap because the investigation of spaces is helped by being identified in the original languages. And finally, there's religion itself. It isn't just a puzzle about what people did, but what they might have felt by doing it, what it meant to them, how it connected them to a cosmos with God in it. Ultimately, these things are also poetic and meaningful in a communal way, where it's never inconsequential if a view is correct or not. And this is on principle, not because we necessarily have a stake in the findings.
What was the hardest part about writing the article?
Well, findings, sifting and reading a lot of text, most of which were never written for the purpose of recording whether or not there were house churches, weighing up the evidence, and especially worrying if my premises were correct. All of that took time. A humanities article may take longer to write than a book, and this piece is an example. I began planning the piece while writing a visceral history of bread, and I then completed that book and started another, Byzantium from the Inside Out, which is coming out with Routledge quite soon, I believe. So depending on how you count time, you could say that I wrote 2 books in the period that it took me to write this one article. And in all that time you fill your study hours with worry about whether or not the case is robust, or perhaps that someone else has said the same thing or will do before you've been able to get it to print. It makes you ever so slightly impatient with yourself and the publishing process. But this frustration is mitigated when the editorial team is as professional as it is at Colloquium. Overall, it was the greatest thrill for me to write. Were there house churches in early Christian times? And I greatly look forward to the reaction of anyone who feels like commenting.